Auto insurance can all seem the same until it comes time to use it. So don't get stuck paying more for less coverage. Switch to USAA Auto Insurance and you could start saving money in no time. Get a quote today. Restrictions apply.
USAA.
You are tuned in to the Foul Weather Podcast, the forecast to your next successful hunt. Coming to you from the home office, Jack's Reef, New York.
In response to a massive amount of misinformation coming across your wavelengths, the Foul Weather Podcast embarked on the 2025 DataStream series. It can be attractive to find conspiracies that help explain what you observe as a duck hunter. Or maybe you've even thought up some fake news yourself. The reality is that the long history of data used in waterfowl conservation and management in North America is a success story that everyone deserves to hear. Bumps and bruises we have, but dedicated we are as the duck people across duck country USA, dedicated to the long-term health of ducks and duck hunting. This series dives deep into how surveys, banding, and harvest surveys and models work. Join us to learn more and share this great information with all the great people across duck country USA that you know. Today, on the Foul Weather Podcast, we cut through the BS to report the facts about how we count ducks and why this information is vital to all the great people across duck country USA. Remember that this last season you knew where the ducks were at before the ducks knew where they're at. We're very thankful for our every week listeners. You folks know who you are. Those that never miss a single migration forecast episode each Monday morning. Y'all are as ate up as me about ducks, duck biology, and duck migration. Our dedicated weekly listeners can pick the best days to hunt because the Foul Weather Podcast forecasts fresh ducks hot from the north. You know where the ducks are at before the ducks know where they're at, right? Shoot the ducks from the north before they know where they're at. Also, just a reminder as well to take a minute to rate us on Spotify and Apple Podcast or wherever you listen. We appreciate your support very, very much. I'm your host, Dr. Mike, coming to you from the home office in Jack's Reef. It is that time of year when episodes 2 weeks apart don't do justice to the rapid changes we see in the North Country as winter turns into spring. I myself put a rush on that flush of green leaves in my life by taking a southern trip last week as part of an invited talk on the state of duck hunting and duck conservation in a changing climate at Mississippi State. It was an awesome crowd with great questions, and I deeply appreciate all my friends and colleagues that came out and welcomed me back to the South with open arms. I also put in some miles walking my old stomping grounds chasing turkeys, but man, it was humbling. 15 years had gone by since I'd walked through those piney ridges, bottomland hardwoods, traversed ravines, and driven all over my favorite backwoods roads. I did not kill a bird. In fact, my first 2 mornings out were greeted with silent woods from the turkeys. But those woods, man, they are a special place, and I cannot express enough how a walk through the smell of a burn of the piney woods brought back amazing memories of working and laying dead longbeards in those big woods. How those towering oaks stood above me as I stared at them in awe, just like I did 15 years ago. Those southern piney woods, towering hardwood stands, and cane bottoms left nothing behind. They gave it their all, and I ate it up like I was back in my younger days. My legs ached, step after step, ridge after ridge, ravine after ravine. My legs definitely ached, but I didn't care. I am a northern boy at heart. Just like many of you are Midwesterners and Southerners and coastal and prairie and intermountain and northwestern. But I tell you, nothing compares to the spring woods in the big woods of the South. All I hoped for this week, years after my turkey success I had when my wife and I lived in Starkville, all I hoped for was a single bird to work, which did happen. Despite that I was likely late in the year with an early spring, it was really an early leaf out there, and the birds really seemed not to be gobbling much. Season had been open for over 3 weeks already. And despite that pressure seemed about tenfold what I remember, despite all other states around Mississippi that bit on the quote-unquote idea, and I'm putting quotes around idea, they bit on the idea that early season disrupts the breeding process in turkeys, right? So what happened to Mississippi last year was that when there was only one state, Mississippi, with an early opener, all the out-of-staters, all the oozers, they inundated Mississippi, and it was lights out for a lot of turkeys, right? One state, Mississippi, that stuck by their guns because the evidence that early seasons were the reason for turkey declines in the Southeast was not great enough, and then they paid the price with their own turkeys' lives. We probably all need to think really hard about how trade-offs happen when we produce information that might influence harvest policies both in the public and scientific communities, right? Words matter. Information matters. Anyhow, I digress. So, I got worked over by a turkey today. I'm actually writing this episode from a hotel room in Birmingham, Alabama, where I fly out tomorrow back to Jack's Reef Country. So, honestly, though, it could not. That hunt could have gone either way. There was likely about a 50% chance that this turkey died, but he won the coin flip. I was on a log road and that I'd walked the first night I arrived. I flew in on Monday and still somehow walked 10,000 steps that day to scout for birds. But I found turkeys at least at one spot, right? So Tuesday they were quiet. It was cold, for the south at that time of year, 38 degrees at sunrise in silence. But my last day, I decided to go back where I'd seen big tom prints in the sand of the log road, and it paid off. No roost gobbles, but maybe right around sunrise, pow, like right around that, when the sun was just starting to peek over the horizon, pow, I got a response to a little soft cluck that I put out. That was my first gobble of the year, was in Mississippi. I haven't heard anything in New York yet, actually. We've been kind of cold and wet. But if you know hill country of Mississippi, you're going to understand this. I had kind of several fingers to choose from, but I had to drop down into a bottom and then back up to get, even close to this bird. I topped that finger and it was it was super narrow at the top. I sat down and I probably would have only had a 10-yard shot before a bird would have come into view, right? And that was no bueno. Like, if he didn't come right up in the right spot, there was no way I was killing that bird. I yelped really quiet, and he lit up again, but down the finger and across another draw pretty far on another finger. So I decided to cut the distance, dropping down out of sight, and I moved about 100 yards downstream to the end of the finger that on my mapping app showed it widened out, right? It was perfect when I got up there. I moved to the top, set a decoy, set against a big oak tree facing downhill with a good view for 60 to 70 yards, settled in, took a deep breath, and I cut on my call real quietly. And this time, wow, pow! I mean, this bird was close, like 45 yards away from me. But unfortunately, at a 45-degree angle over my right shoulder and behind me, right, where the finger was narrow, man, I felt this bird gobble in my soul. There was like that rumble in the background. And there's nothing to do at this point other than spin on a tree and hope he doesn't see you, right? Because he's already a little bit uphill from you and unlikely to come very far back down, if at all. Gobblers tend to go uphill in the first thing in the morning, especially if he's an old boy, which I was sure he was, and that was really my situation. So I had to move on this bird. At some point, I tried to sit there for a second, listen for him drumming and leaves moving, but it had rained the night before. So I kind of kept moving my head back and forth at about a 45-degree angle, playing the odds I'd see the cue ball at the right time coming over the hill and him not me moving. But he never showed. And then a hen cut up and yacked away, kind of downhill and across a little bit. But she was kind of behind me and the tom ahead of me. I was thinking, wow, this is gold, that at least somehow I ended up in between this hen and this tom. And some time went by. I just kind of had fun having a bitch off session with that hen, and it felt like 15 minutes, but as you know, it was probably more like 5. Eventually that tom sounded off again, but at 150 yards and moving away from both of us. At this point, I knew I was toast for the most part. Having seen this before, he was just doing his routine, and it was likely how he hadn't been killed to date. He never topped the hill. He kind of hugged the side of the finger, never came on top. And that's the kind of thing that lets a bird live, right? It's not like he's any smarter. He might just have a pattern that's different. I believe turkeys live beyond 3 years for only a few reasons. 1, they live on private or leased land with rules and limited hunter days. Or 2, they don't play by the playbook. And I think this bird didn't even come on top. He hung on the side of the finger the entire time. And even when I moved to get back up above him, pulled myself quietly up to the top location where he was headed, he never came up on top. He just worked side hills the whole time. This bird hung on the side of those fingers, and man, he humbled me. My game, my main play, as noted in episode 80, turkey tagout tips and why turkeys are tanking. My play is to get in a place where the turkeys can't see you until they're within range. And when they pop up on top, right, they're easily dead, right? Nobody should ever do this in places with beard restrictions, but I've smoked turkeys with just heads coming out from a tree at 10 yards uphill and had them fall and die at my feet, right? These birds are the type that are drumming and rumbling, right? They're toms, right? But you should also never do that because you're never certain that that's the bird, and you could shoot a jake. But anyhow, I tried to get above this bird, but this big bird worked me over today. After the close encounter, I worked down, then back up above him, as I said. And the last time he gobbled, he was still on the side ridge, and he was still going away from me. So there was no chance for this bird. So anyhow, I do think if I had 2 more days, I would have bagged that bird because I think I figured out his pattern. But I don't think anybody else is killing that bird this year. He really didn't gobble many times. I'd say maybe 8 times in the morning. My guess is he went silent because he henned up, but I can't be certain. Anyhow, well, that's my turkey story. I will be back, but damn, this place, is ate up with people more than I've ever seen before, and it looked like, a lot of the New York duck world, I would say, post-COVID. Like, everyone figured out that weekends alone don't work, so I'm going to leave the opening at this week. I think pressure on game has increased substantially on public lands, and the big woods of Mississippi are awesome. Mississippi will always have a place in my heart. Next up, we dive deep into how the BPOP is conducted, so please stick with us. Look, folks, the Farmland Group across the Mid-South is your one-stop shop for real estate brokerage, consulting, management, lending, and appraisals. If you own land or you want land, the Farmland Group is where it's at. With over $500 million in farm sales and growing, Gwynn and Shelby Smith have you covered. Look, if you're thinking about buying or selling, contact the Farmland Group to access their full suite of services. If you already own property and want to build equity and value, the Farmland Group gets it done. If you're looking to purchase a new property, well, they get that done too, and they have access to some of the best lending available. Looking to sell? Get it appraised with a Farmland Group affiliated appraiser. But let's be clear for our listenership too. They also offer farm and hunt property management to create places that attract more ducks and more bucks. Who doesn't want that? More ducks and more bucks. Let the Farmland Group build value into your property. Find them today at farmlg.com. That's farmlg.com. You're not going to be disappointed. Contact Shelby Smith today at farmlg.com and let him know that the Foul Weather Podcast sent you their way. Okay, on to the topic at hand. Is the BPOP wrong? First, I want to express very strongly how much this is definitely the wrong question. Rather, the question should be, is the BPOP good enough for making conservation and harvest management decisions for waterfowl? In that, I will emphatically answer yes, most of the time. In this episode, I will detail the thorough critical reviews of the BPOP survey and continual work towards improving population estimates, many based on technological advances that have improved estimates. But what we really need to remember is that we should likely only change the survey if it has substantial gain. That is, changes to the survey need much thought because what you might throw out is standardization and comparability across years for only marginal improvements in population estimates. Nobody working for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service or Canadian Wildlife Service takes these changes lightly. And I can tell you, after poring over hundreds of pages of critical reviews and technical documents, these folks take counting ducks very seriously. I also need to express how the administrators and pilot biologists have worked very hard to increase efficiency in the surveys because their budgets have been frozen for so long. That is, the Mike Bird's office has not seen a budget increase for substantial time for sustaining the BPOP that would keep up with inflation. Having gone through this at times in academia, it is like getting a pay cut every single year, and after 10 years, capacity becomes greatly reduced. In a time when we are reducing federal spending to look for greater efficiency, we really need to be doing the opposite for the Migratory Birds Office. These folks are working really hard on a shoestring budget, and that makes doing business properly nearly impossible. Remember that the Waterfowl Breeding Population and Habitat Survey, or what we're calling BPOP on this episode, must occur. It has to occur so we can determine if the waterfowl population is great enough for harvest to happen. Right? Duck season is closed in perpetuity every year until we can show without reasonable doubt that the population can sustain the harvest we prescribe. All of this happens in a very organized manner each year with highly trained professionals conducting counts, surveys, analyses, and so on to ensure we have a duck season that aligns with the Migratory Bird Treaty Act and other important legislation. In this, we also should not take lightly the need to have international and federal coordination of efforts for birds that have needs well beyond state borders. The 1920 Supreme Court ruling in the case of Missouri versus Holland that upheld the Migratory Bird Treaty Act is a perfect example of how federal oversight of migratory birds is not only within the rights under the Constitution, but it is necessary for the proper conservation and management of migratory birds. In this case, the state of Missouri brought a case against Game Warden Holland of the United States for attempting to enforce the Migratory Bird Treaty Act of 1918. The entire case can be found by a Google search online, and the Cornell Law School has an excellent archive of many cases under the Migratory Bird Treaty Act. Missouri held that the Migratory Bird Treaty Act was in violation of the 10th Amendment, which deals with state rights. But its interpretation also details how to reconcile problems when issues fall under national interests. The explanation and upholding the Migratory Bird Treaty Act is long, so we're not going to detail all of it here. But to quote a portion of it, acts of Congress are the supreme law of the land only when made in pursuance of the Constitution, while treaties are declared to be so when made under the authority of the United States. It is open to question whether the authority of the United States mean more than the formal acts prescribed to make the convention. We do not mean to imply that there are no qualifications to the treaty-making power, but they must be ascertained in a different way. It is obvious that there may be matters of sharpest exigency for the nation's well-being that an act of Congress could not deal with, but that a treaty followed by such an act could. Okay, I don't know what, it's EXIGENCY, so anybody want to write me and tell me what that word exactly means? That's great, well-schooled in all kinds of vocabulary, but that's a new one for me. Anyhow, this basically states that Congress has the authority to sign treaties that are then upheld by the courts of the United States if said treaty does not violate the Constitution and is necessary to the well-being of the nation. Judge Holmes, on this case, goes on to state, and this quote to me is the most important part of this ruling. Here it goes. To put the claim of the state upon title is to lean upon a slender reed. Wild birds are not in the possession of anyone, and possession is the beginning of ownership. The whole foundation of the state's rights is the presence within their jurisdiction of birds that yesterday had not arrived, tomorrow may be in another state, and in a week 1,000 miles away. If we are to be accurate, we cannot put the case of the state upon higher ground than that the treaty deals with creatures that for a moment are within the state's boundaries, that it must be carried out by the officers of the United States within the same territory, and that but for the treaty, the state would be free to regulate the subject itself. And there you have it. The Migratory Bird Treaty Act is vitally important to oversight of a national and international resource that can only be truly managed properly at the federal level. States acting individually in this case would be disastrous to wild birds. In this case, waterfowl populations and waterfowl management set just to states would have a complete lack of coherence. Now, don't get me wrong. I'm mostly a government stay-out-of-my-business type person. But in this case, the business of managing migratory birds is certainly well-placed, and we should remember the history that has led to well-coordinated surveys and a format to deliver a duck season to all the great people across Duck Country, USA each season. Nobody at the federal level is taking this lightly, and flippant comments about how the mallard sex ratio is resulting in paper ducks is not a new conversation. And as I've said, when delivered in a misinformed manner, this can actually be damaging to all the great work done for waterfowl on this continent and by our wholly competent waterfowl professionals delivering these surveys, compiling data, and producing the vital reports so that we can have a duck season each year. Among the reviews of the BPOP survey, sex ratios are a topic of consideration, along with many other considerations about how to improve the survey. Full critical reviews of the survey with the intent of improving the BPOP were conducted in 1973, 1984, and 1995, with numerous small modifications in between and after, many a result of technological changes. The reviews have focused on improving survey efficiency, that is, reducing the magnitude of standard errors with the goal of estimating continental population size for the most abundant North American duck species. In an effort to improve precision and reduce estimation bias, analyses and recommendations concentrated particularly on visibility correction in the prairie strata where the majority of ducks are counted. So let's talk about how the BPOP is conducted. First, we're going to hit on the traditional survey area, which has been operational since 1955. The traditional survey consists of 52 strata extending from coastal Alaska through the boreal forest to western Ontario and through the parklands and prairies south to South Dakota. The eastern survey area, some of which has been surveyed since 1990 but was not operational till 1995, consists of 20 strata covering portions of Ontario, Quebec, Labrador, the Canadian Maritimes, New York, and Maine. Population estimates for the eastern survey area combine U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service aerial data with data from Canadian Wildlife Service helicopter plot surveys. Thus, the analytical methods and interpretation of the results differ between the traditional and eastern surveys. The survey timing of the BPOP is not the same each year and is based on migration and nesting phenology. The 1987 Standard Operating Procedure, or SOP, instructs prairie crews to delay survey initiation until the majority of northern breeding species have moved through their crew area and the majority of late nesting species have arrived and are dispersed onto breeding territories. These criteria have typically been applied by assessing species composition as well as social organizations or groupings of ducks in the southern portion of each prairie crew area. The 1987 SOP specifically instructs prairie crews to initiate the survey before early nesting mallards begin to be observed in post-breeding flocks of 3 to 4 drakes. Reconnaissance flights and coordination with ground crews assist in determining the appropriate survey start date. In the bush strata, that is north of the prairies, criteria for survey initiation include spring breakup of ice, buildup of representative waterfowl, and dispersal of pairs onto territories. A commonly cited criterion for survey initiation in the prairies is the observance of a near 1-to-1 ratio of lone, drakes, and pairs of early nesting species during reconnaissance flights. The 1-to-1 criterion may be related to observation in a 1969 survey report that notes during the egg-laying period in mallards, the pair-to-lone drake ratio is near 1, and that this ratio decreases in the number of small 3 to 4 drake flocks increases during the incubation period. A high positive correlation between survey start date in prairie strata and average spring temperature suggests that prairie crews are consistent in annually adjusting survey initiation for variation in spring phenology, which is assumed to be a reasonable surrogate for the duck kind of nesting phenology. So not only are survey crews flying transects and counting ducks in ponds, but they also conduct recon flights to ensure they are starting the survey at the appropriate time. For each stratum consists of 2 to 18 transects, with the number of transects depending on the density of ducts, with more closely spaced transects with greater average duct densities. The aerial cruise consists of the pilot observer and a second observer. They fly at around 120 miles per hour and count ducks out to 200 meters from the plane. Observers are trained on what 200 meters from the plane looks like and often use tape on the windows to demarcate the max distance for counting. The pilot, they just count ducks because they also have to fly the plane, right? In the prairie strata, the observer counts ducks and ponds, and the following groups are recorded. 1. Lone drakes, which is a single drake without a visible associated hen. Lone hens are not recorded. 2. Flocked drakes, that is, 2 or more drakes in close association, right? Only flocks of 2 to 4 drakes are doubled. And then 3, a paired male with a female in close association, which is a pair. And then 4, which is groups. 3 or more of a mixed sex group in a close association that cannot be separated into singles and pairs. So a hen and 2 drakes are recorded as a pair, and a lone drake and 5 or more flock drakes are recorded as a group. Okay, that's a lot. So in the end, total indicated pairs, because here's the deal, right? You have to count a drake as a pair because the hen may be off nesting, right? So total indicated pairs is 2 times lone drakes or flocked drakes in a group less than 5. So when we see 2 to 4 drakes together in, say, mallards, we count those, we double those, right? We obviously consider pairs as 2 birds, and then we also add those group birds. For species with known strong bias sex ratios towards males, lone drakes are not doubled. This includes redheads, scaup, ringneck ducks, ruddy ducks, and swans and coots are not doubled because it's not possible to distinguish sex in them. Temporary water, sheet water, small wet areas in fields and wet depressions, which can be expected to persist for less than 3 weeks, roadside or borrow ditches, and muskegs are not counted as ponds. So right there, the comment that pond counts must be wrong because of all the drain tile, well, that may not be entirely true because a lot of these shallow depressions and fields are already not counted under the current SOP. Survey times are from 1 to 2 hours after sunrise to noon each day. They're not conducted when weather conditions are adverse, wind, rain, fog, dust, and so on. Following the aerial crews in the prairie and parkland portions of the survey area, ground crews count all waterfowl in the segment boundaries on a subset of transects to develop visibility correction factors, or VCFs, because air crews certainly miss some ducks. Aerial crews develop maps with segments identified on aerial photos. The ground crew of 2 to 4 people also count ponds in the segment. All this takes a lot of coordination between aerial crews and trained ground crew biologists, often permanently or seasonally stationed at national wildlife refuges and U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service management districts. I'm going to tell you, a lot of these people are on temporary appointments, and the cutback in the service really hurts the capacity to conduct the ground crew surveys. Anyhow, sidebar there. There are nuances about how water is counted by ground crews as well, because they also collect information about the type of wetland as well as other finer scale metrics like vegetation type that the aerial survey crew cannot see while flying by at 120 miles per hour. Again, for this reason, the idea that drain tile alone makes May pond counts useless and there is really less water out there than recorded, well, that idea, it holds less water than you think. It's also interesting that we could certainly investigate these data to a greater extent to potentially understand how drain tile is affecting May pond counts. But also, let's remember, as noted already today, that any water expected to last less than 3 weeks, like puddles in fields, that's typically subject to drain tile, those areas aren't counted and included in the May pond count estimates anyway. In simplest terms, and not getting into the weeds, At this point, these data are scaled up from the amount of area in the survey transects to the total area of the strata after applying the visual correction factors for birds missed by aerial survey crews. VCFs are calculated each year for each stratum because research shows it varies by species, year, and crew members. So there's no real good way to increase efficiency by only having VCF factors, visual correction factors applied broadly after doing them once. So we need those people on the ground. We need those ground crews to count ducks, provide us the correction factor, and also collect additional information on the wetlands. Okay. Honestly, man, being a pilot biologist is likely one of the coolest jobs in the wildlife conservation world. The training is extensive for the pilot biologists as well as the observers. The pilot biologists also typically work to review the methods and design the surveys, and they also run substantial banding stations across the traditional survey area later in the season. Given the continual improvements to the BPOP survey, and specifically a major overhaul in 1975 to standardize how crews in the prairies, parklands, and boreal were counting ducks, some data among years were not comparable previously, but the recommendation now is that any time series investigation not use data prior to 1975. Since 1975, changes in SOP have been mild at best, with small changes mostly based on improved technology. Currently, there's ongoing discussion about another critical review since the last one was conducted back in 1995, but understand that there is always continual discussion, coordination, and reports focused on improving the survey. Next up, we're going to talk about the Eastern Survey, state surveys, and some reflection on the quality of the BPOP, so please stick with us. Hold on, folks, don't turn that channel. We've got some really exciting news for you. The Foul Weather Podcast has teamed up with Wildlife Strategies. That's right. I'm now working directly with Ryan Delaney of Wildlife Strategies to build value into your land. Wildlife Strategies is already known for quality wildlife habitat management, be it deer, turkeys, ducks, or whatever you pursue. Ryan knows his stuff. Look, I don't add my name to just any business, but I believe in what Wildlife Strategies is doing for landowners throughout the Southeast U.S. and beyond. If you want science-based solutions to create great wildlife habitat, Wildlife Strategies is your best bet. If you're interested in ducks, when we say, may your skies be filled, well, Wildlife Strategies does just that. They fill your skies with ducks. Contact Ryan Delaney today at ryan@farmlg.com for a site visit. You won't be disappointed you did. Ryan covers the southern tier of states, and I'm available to build habitat management plans across the northern tier. Contact us today for a quote. The Wildlife Strategies team sees your property through from the initial assessment and development of a 3-year time frame management plan through annual check-ins and course corrections as needed. Contact Ryan today at ryan@farmlg.com or Dr. Mike at foulweather.co. You won't be disappointed you did. Fill your skies with ducks and your forests and fields with deer and turkey with Wildlife Strategies. All right, let's move on to the Eastern Survey area, which has been operational since 1995. The intent here was to provide new estimates of waterfowl abundance in the eastern U.S., which also kind of corresponded to the timing of separating the harvest strategy for the Atlantic flyway from the mid-continent process. In general, waterfowl in the east have much more stable water conditions and abundances of waterfowl through time. The density and abundance of most waterfowl species is certainly less than the more productive prairies, but these populations don't go through the same wet-dry cycle, so from a regulatory perspective, it didn't make sense to use mid-continent waterfowl populations to set regulations. The Eastern Survey area uses a composite estimate that also has a modeling procedure to smooth out unrealistic annual changes that are more associated with survey bias than real changes in populations. There are transects flown by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service that are combined with helicopter plot surveys by the Canadian Wildlife Service, and then states from New Hampshire to Virginia conduct a square kilometer ground-based plot survey, which aims to develop robust estimates primarily for mallards, wood ducks, and Canada geese. This U.S.-based survey is combined with aerial surveys, and again, in a Bayesian model-based framework, develops a composite population estimate. These estimates are in the annual trends and status report like the traditional survey area, but only the top 5 most abundant duck species are reported to the public. Species like scaup and pintails, even though they occur in relatively good number, but just lower nesting densities, and are the origin of a good amount of the Atlantic flyway harvest at times, those ducks are not reported to the public. Overall, Quebec likely generates a good amount of the ducks harvested in portions of the Atlantic flyway, at least for some species like green-winged teal, scaup, and pintails. Some states have aerial and ground-based surveys that are also now included in the waterfowl trends and status report. These locations include Washington, Oregon, California, Minnesota, Wisconsin, and Michigan, largely because these states realized from banding data that many of their harvested ducks were produced locally, so they wanted to track this population independently. So that pretty much wraps up our description of the BPOP survey, the traditional area, the Eastern Survey area, and the states that are added into those estimates. Criticisms of the BPOP survey come from within the survey crew themselves, other government waterfowl professionals, academicians, and the hunting public. But I'd say that the folks conducting the surveys are their own worst critics and constantly trying to make the survey better. Throwing shade on the survey is fine, but understand that any changes to the BPOP must be calculated and result in real improvements. Nobody is changing the survey for the sake of changing the survey to appease the next critic. Sex ratios in some species of ducks have changed towards a male bias, and this seemingly has been happening during a period of massive landscape change, largely driven by commodity prices and specifically the ethanol craze that drove up profit per bushel to a point that conservation programs couldn't keep up. Specifically, the drake-to-hen ratio in mallards is a result of lower survival during summer. But how it has changed the BPOP and if paper ducks is an issue is truly questionable. Folks have looked at these changes in groups of males through time in the BPOP, and it isn't clear because other factors, including timing of the survey and water conditions on the prairies, can affect how many groups of 2 to 4 males are counted. Remember, as incubation starts, territories by pairs start to dissolve, and males will hang out more together, even if they are technically still paired. So maybe some of this had to do with the advance of spring weather and fast warm-ups, and that crews just can't get ahead of, and then they end up counting more groups of males. Also, we already know that wetland consolidation is an issue from farmers draining smaller wetlands into larger ones. And also, under a drying prairie, just fewer potholes are available. So on some years, you're going to naturally see groups of 2 to 4 male mallards together because the availability of wetlands is less and they are not spread out as singles on territories. So it's not as easy to just start to call groups of 2 to 4 male mallards as singles. And remember, any group of male mallards of 5 or more is counted as singles anyway. I'm not wholly convinced that BPOP surveys are that far off. Anyhow, regarding May ponds and that drain tile is rampant and those wetlands are all dried up after they fly over and count them, well, I'll just leave it here. We already know that puddles and fields are not counted, and that is much of the drain tile out there. That seems to be the claim, that those wetlands aren't available a few weeks later, so the prairies must be drier and there should be fewer ponds going into the harvest decision matrix. But those aren't counted anyway. Sure, there's drain tile and other wetlands. That is partially how wetland consolidation is happening. But there's also ground interpretation of May ponds by the ground crews that is factored into the final pond count. Last, I'm going to do this. Have a look at the Foul Weather Podcast Facebook page today and this week, and you're going to see some interesting graphics. They are the BPOP plotted against the duck harvest per hunter day for a bunch of states. In some cases, what you're going to see is a crazy solid relationship between BPOP and harvest per hunter effort. Of course, there's some nuances each year because of how weather affects annual migration and whether those ducks show up to states or not. but it says two things to me. The BPOP is doing a pretty darn good job of predicting duck abundance, which in turn affects duck hunting success per unit effort. And the one that we're going to cover in this next DataStream series, the Harvest Information Program, it also, to me, says the Harvest Information Program is likely also tracking duck harvest well enough despite its bumps and bruises. So there it is. The question isn't if the BPOP is wrong. Again, that is the wrong question. The question is if the BPOP is right enough for decision making, and in that, we have confidence. Into the future, critical reviews and improvements to the survey will continue, and we wish all the hardworking pilot biologists, observers, ground crews, and number crunchers the best at sustaining this largest wildlife survey in the world. This survey that is the envy of the world, and we also hope that their budgets improve, or at least are sustained, so we can keep informed in ways that keeps these ducks with us for all the great people across Duck Country, USA. One last note. We recently launched the Young Waterfowl Professional Series that will run every other week through this spring and summer. If you are interested in being a guest on the Foul Weather Podcast Young Waterfowl Professional Series, please reach out. These folks are the future of waterfowl conservation, and their stories need to be told. These interviews also go on our YouTube channel, so please subscribe for free there to meet all these great new young professionals throughout 2025. Next week, we meet with Ryan Askren of Five Oaks. Thanks for listening, and as always, may your skies be filled and shoot straight, my friends.